You guys, we need to make some noise and we need to do it right now. House Republicans just released their budget resolution, and in it, they're aiming to cut Medicaid by at least $880 billion. And they want to cut SNAP, aka food stamps, by at least 20%. $880 billion. Now, where did they get that number from? Oh, well, would you look at that? It turns out $880 billion is the entire Medicaid budget, meaning this budget from House Republicans seeks to eliminate Medicaid completely. They think they could get away with this by just calling it a budget cut. We're not going to let them. We need to spread the word. We need to sound the alarm. Medicaid is such an important program that helps millions and millions of Americans. Medicaid provides coverage to eligible low-income families, pregnant women, elderly adults, people with disabilities, and so much more. And they want to strip this program away from people. By the way, remember all those times throughout the campaign where they promised they would never touch Medicaid? They would never do that. Well, they lied again like they always lie. So folks, I know so many people who rely on Medicaid, so I'm counting on you to get this message out. Do not let them do this, because if they get this budget to the floor, they're going to be able to pass this through a process called budget reconciliation. That means they could pass this without even having to worry about the filibuster. They could just pass it, push it through with a simple majority, meaning all it takes is the Republicans to push this through and ruin millions of Americans' lives. And by the way, at the same time they're doing this, they are trying to pass a $4.5 trillion tax cut for billionaires. Spread this far and wide, folks. And if you appreciate these updates, remember to add the Midas Touch podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
In this subcommittee, we will fight the war on waste shoulder to shoulder with President Trump, Elon Musk, and the Doge team. This week, we turn our attention to improper payments by the federal government, including in Medicaid and Medicare.
The party of family values and the party that wants us all to bow the knee at God or Jesus has released a budget. They want to get $880 billion for Medicaid, and Medicaid provides essential health care for the poor and also for the elderly. See, Medicare doesn't cover things like nursing homes and memory care, which our aging parents need. Medicaid is what picks up the difference in that. I think they forgot the words of Jesus where he said to take care of the widow and the children. Oh, but they want to add for immigration, enforcement, and military. And military accounts for over 18% of our budget. They also want to cut food stamps and SNAP to children. So the party that wants us to believe that they value life so much they need to protect a newborn wants to make sure that they're not medically cared for or fed.
Elon Musk is planning to pay for his tax cut with your healthcare. The Republican Party is hard at work looking at close to $5 trillion in tax cuts, primarily for the wealthy and corporations. This is things like lowering the corporate tax rate. Again, remember, President Trump took the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% in the first year of his first term. They don't want to stop there. They want to take another bite at the apple. They're also interested in ensuring that the richest Americans get an additional tax break. Those tax breaks that the rich got in 2017 are slated to expire in 2025, and they want to make sure that the rich keep getting their preferred tax status. So they are looking to make deep cuts to the programs that the rest of us need to pay for those tax cuts. And increasingly, it seems like Doge is going to be one of the central entities, and Musk himself is going to be in charge of making those decisions about how deep those cuts are so that he can get another tax break. They are planning to circumvent Congress and go for some big cuts administratively, which was the play they tried last week. Potentially, this explains why Musk is after the Treasury Payment Service in the first place.
Which is surely going to help that falling birth rate that those Republicans are worried about right now and encourage marriage and growing families, right? Sounds like there's a lot more childless cat ladies out there in the future.
That means I don't think a lot of people understand the volume of people that are going to die if Medicaid gets taken away. That means elderly people who use Medicaid to pay for their nursing home. I guess they're just going to throw them out onto the street. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. That means people who use Medicaid to pay for their chemotherapy can no longer access it. That means people who use Medicaid to pay for their diabetes care no longer can access it. And that means that I think it's 4 out of 10 births in America not going to be covered anymore, because 4 out of every 10 births is paid for by Medicaid. And one thing that I don't see a lot of people talking about is the people who are not on Medicaid yet, but would need to access it in the future. Because those people, you've already signed their death sentence as well. There are a lot of people in this country who have stayed with abusive family members or stayed with abusive partners because they need the financial assistance, and going out on their own, they can't afford it. When you take away safety nets like Medicaid, guess what? You're signing their death warrant, because then they're in the position of, do I stay and have access to private insurance, but maybe die by the hands of my abuser or through negligence of my family members who are supposed to be my caretakers? Or do I go out on my own where I can afford nothing, not housing, not food, and definitely not medical care, and then just die that way?
Well, here we are, the first big budget, the economic agenda, not just for the next year, but over the next decade. And what we see is $4.5 trillion of tax cuts, almost all of which go to the richest 1% of Americans. But that's not all. The way they propose to pay for that $4.5 trillion of tax cuts is through deficit financing, combined with almost $900 billion in cuts to Medicaid and Obamacare. So in the end of the day, it's going to be middle-class families that pay for a tax cut that mostly goes to the top 1%.
Obviously a narcissistic discard by the United States. They have used the American people. They have ravaged us as consumers and as employees of everything we have. And now we're in late stage capitalism. They have all of the power. They have no use for us. So now Trump is the face of what looks like another great American era, but it's really the intentional discard of us and them cutting and running after they've taken everything. So now what they're really doing is that they're just breaking up the United States government for parts to just take every little bit out of it. That's what they're trying to do. Strip every little last piece of worth so that the American people truly have nothing left. Trump supporters and MAGA clearly don't know what narcissism is if it hit them in the face, and actually it may have hit them in the face, because the only reason that you would find this acceptable is if you've experienced it before and you think it's normal. So they're clinging to their abuser while their abuser is pretending to care, but is actively destroying all of their resources and preparing to cast them aside like they're nothing.
They are going to hit a button and things can go sideways. We already saw that last week when they were like, oh yeah, we're going to freeze everything. That sounds so cool. Let's do that. They hit the freeze button, and then Medicaid portals across the United States got suspended through that EO. And they tried to make up for it and be like, oh, that has nothing to do with all of it. Really? You're going to freeze all federal programs and then the Medicaid portal suspended, and you think people are going to think that's not connected? So what they're trying to do is that under the guise of waste, they are going to try to cut and gut some of the most essential federal programs that we've got. In fact, how do we know this? Because the Republican majority and their budget had a sensitive internal document that got leaked a couple of weeks ago. And I can tell you that I read through it, and they identified bit by bit everything from the mortgage interest tax deduction to Medicaid itself. They have identified as wanting to eliminate in order to pay for Elon Musk's tax breaks, Jeff Bezos's tax breaks, Mark Zuckerberg's tax breaks, and other sorts of giveaways to the wealthiest people and corporations in this country. The biggest one that they are going after is Medicaid, okay? They have Medicaid in their sights, and they want to cut $2 trillion. What are they not going to include in their government waste assessments? Take a big guess. Defense spending. It's defense contractors who are making a killing. And just so you know, when you see these big tech people, many of them are also defense contractors. Elon Musk gets his money from defense. Inevitably, they are going to hit a button.
Project 2025 wants to add work requirements to Medicaid. Here is why that doesn't quite do what everybody thinks that it does. Work requirements actually aren't even just a Project 2025 thing. This is a long-standing policy that Republicans have pushed. Various states have tried it as well. So what are work requirements? If you are an adult under the age of 60 who is living in poverty prior to the passage of the ACA, you were not eligible for Medicaid unless you were pregnant. A lot of right-leaning policymakers and thinkers would argue that you are actually not as deserving of Medicaid as some of the other people who are qualifying, such as the elderly, people who are living with disabilities, pregnant women, and children. Because of that, a lot of politicians and thinkers want to add what's called work requirements in order for this specific group of people to be able to get onto Medicaid. What that looks like in practice can vary, but basically think of it as you have to log some work hours, saying maybe you've worked a minimum of 40 hours per month, or that you're volunteering, taking classes, just something. The idea behind this is that people who are on Medicaid and are poor, this is going to incentivize those people to make sure that they're working, make sure that they're gainfully employed, and it's going to make sure that they are not just relying on Medicaid and sitting at home doing nothing. So that's the idea, and it makes it sound politically palatable, especially to those more right-leaning states where people do tend to look askance at people who are just poor in general and are taking state benefits. In essence, it makes citizens, it makes politicians be able to say like, hey, these people are actually deserving of this somewhat. Here is how that ends up working out in practice. The vast majority of poor adults are actually already working. So you can't actually further incentivize something that people are already doing. However, when work requirements are instituted, despite the fact that people are actually working, you will usually see a lot of people fall off of Medicaid eligibility. Why? Basically because of red tape. If you're located in a rural area, maybe you don't have that great internet access, it can be hard to kind of figure out or even get onto the internet to be able to log the hours the way that you're supposed to. If you haven't really heard about the new requirements, if you're not really sure how they work, you may end up falling off because you just can't quite figure it out. Again, even though you're working. For some people, the barrier to them working is not because they don't want to work, it's because they actually are unwell and they need access to this healthcare to get better in order to then work. So dropping them off of Medicaid kind of puts them in this catch-22. Additionally, adding work requirements to programs like Medicaid means that you have to hire an extra however many people to now administer this extra piece. You have to create some sort of method for people to be able to log their hours or for you to be able to figure out how many hours they're working. You have to get the word out, you have to educate people, all of which requires a lot of manpower. It ends up that you increase the administrative cost of the program, and the Medicaid savings actually comes through the fact that people just get confused, can't figure it out, can't figure out how to work the new program, and end up falling off of Medicaid even though they're eligible and are working.